My name is Mary Wabuikanyi, a PhD Research Fellow from the University of Nairobi Women's Economic Empowerment Hub. In this video, we are going to focus on Professor Patricia Kameri Bota. Kindly introduce yourself.
My name is Daisy Amdany. I was born here in Nairobi some years back. Born and raised in Nairobi. I went to school here in Nairobi, actually in this general area, really, not far from here. I went to kindergarten, actually just here in Westlands, a place called Green Gates. Then I went to Consolata for primary. Then I went to Musangari, Loreto Musangari for secondary school. Then I went to the Polytechnic, Nairobi Polytechnic, for institutional management. And then I went to Switzerland for hotel management. I came back. I stayed there for a while and worked in the hotel industry, and then got homesick and decided to come back home to Kenya, where that is really how I got into issues of women advocacy for women's non-discrimination against women, because up until then I'd never really encountered discrimination against women. We were never raised with those kinds of distinctions. We were just children when we grew up. I had the privilege of doing my high school in an all-girls school. It was a school run by nuns, and we were never conditioned to imagine that we were lesser than boys. They taught us to excel and to reach for the sky in any discipline. And so it was quite a shock when, after coming back, and of course, I mean, even going abroad, I had the privilege of, when I graduated from college, working in an establishment that was actually run by women. The owner of the establishment, which was a 4-star hotel, was a woman. The general manager was a woman. So all around me, there was women exercising leadership, management, and so for me, it was never a question that no limitations on the basis of my sex. Until I came home. When I got homesick, I decided to come back home. And the first thing, of course, I started looking for work within the hotel industry, because that's what I studied. And the first thing I encountered was in an interview, the job that I applied for, the manager who was interviewing me said he would not give me the job because I was a woman. And I was very shocked. And I was like, what? You're not going to give me a job because I'd never heard that. And I was like, why? And he said, employing women is very problematic, especially in these kinds of a senior position like this, because you're still very young. You're going to want to get married. In fact, he said, you'll go and get married and start having children. You want maternity leave. You want that. And I said, really? I mean, I've come to you. I'm just seeking employment. Those are not part of my plans. But even if they were, why would you refuse to give me a job? Why not look at my credentials? So I was like, I wouldn't even want to work in an establishment like that. He actually said instead that they would offer me housekeeping. And so I thought, and not to demean housekeeping, but that's not what I was applying for. And so I said, I'm not interested in working there. The next place I went to, they told me that they would take me as an intern. And I was like, what do you mean? I've graduated, I've worked, I have work experience. Why would you take me in as an intern? But later on, somebody told me, it's because they have this attitude towards women. And so I thought, this is perhaps not an industry that I would want to work in here in Kenya. And so I went to work in a firm that was doing PR and advertising as an assistant media manager. And it was very interesting that at that point, also by coincidence, I discovered that the women were actually being paid less for the same work that men were doing. And I found that quite strange. And it also happened that it was just post the Beijing had already happened. So there was a lot of talk about women's empowerment and everything. And I remember speaking to the director, and he was like, don't bring those things of Beijing. I didn't know much about Beijing at that time, but he was like, don't bring those Beijing things here. And I was like, what's Beijing? Now, a good friend of mine who is now Lady Justice Njoki Ndongo, we were talking, and I said, this is just incredible. I was just explaining to her, and she said, it's a real thing, eh? And she had just opened the Kenya chapter of Women in Law and Development in Africa, WILDAF. And she said, you really need to come and see, because this is a real problem that women face all the time. And so through that is when I really encountered, discrimination, saw how women and girls are discriminated against. And I was like, this is wrong, And so that is really how I got ushered into the work around women's rights. And I think we met around that time, and it was just, for me, I remember the first time I went to West Pokot, and I met these women, and they were telling me, the whole life experience was like a punishment. They talked about how they are denied the right to go to school, they are circumcised, they are forced into marriage, and I couldn't imagine a life like that. And I realized that I've led such a sheltered life, and that it's really a lottery of life is a lottery. You don't get to choose where you're born. And I was like, it could have even been me. It could have been me. I could have been one of these women here. And I've often wondered what has been constrained within these women. What talents and what giftings have we denied them the right to manifest, just by excluding them and oppressing them and denying them the opportunity to go to school or to have an expanded worldview. And so that's really how I got into this sector. Of course, I later on also went on to study church ministry, because I was also interested. At some point, I got interested in preaching, and I thought, I wanted to preach. So that's like a mix up of my experiences. My work has really been influenced by my experiences. Yeah.
Tell us about your role in the constitution making process.
So I ended up getting involved in the constitution making because of the role that lady, now at that time she was a nominated member of parliament, and WILDAF. So the women's rights organizations that were being organized by the Women's Political Alliance and Women's Political Caucus and the Collaborative Center for Gender and Development really brought together the women's rights organizations to begin the advocacy around issues of the issues of women in the Constitution. So really, that is how I ended up getting involved, because by that time, Bomas was actually coming to a close. By the time now I was getting involved, because now, after now leaving the private sector to now come into civil society through WILDAF, this is how I encountered. And so that is where I met people like Professor Wanjiko Kabira, people like Waboikani, Kamla Sekand, Rose Warohio, Cecilia Kememia. There was Alison Chelaite, Professor Julia Ojiambo, and all these women who were working together. But of course, it was under actually the leading of Women's Political Alliance that had brought the women's rights organizations together and were equipping us with the skills to go out and do the advocacy around safeguarding the women's gains. Because by that time, the Bomas process was already threatened. The politics of the day was now threatening everything. Kanu had just been defeated in an election, and the incoming government, I think they were very satisfied with now the fact that they are in government. And so the Bomas process started getting the interference of the politics, plus also now the denial of the honoring of the MOU that they did. So that politics now trickled in. And it was very interesting, because what happened was the government ended up walking out of the Bomas process, and the women had done so well, really, in terms of organizing themselves, and making sure that the delegates from the district, who Moi, of course, had insisted had to be maendeleo ya wanawake, and those days it was KANU maendeleo ya wanawake. So of course they expected those women to be pro whatever position. But the women's rights organizations had really worked together. I remember, Wamboi, you people, you used to even go and sit with the delegates at night and explain to them why it is important to safeguard the women's gains and not to give way. Because at some point, I remember even some of the members of parliament were telling these rural women that these positions that you are creating for this queen, the district positions, remember the district woman, and they said you are creating a queen who is going to be like overseeing everything, and this is more for these elite women, it's not for you rural women. And I remember it took now the efforts of the women's rights organizations that would go and educate these delegates even through the night at the hotels, the different hotels where they were, and explain to them why it was important to stick together. And I think that really helped. And the fact that despite the politics, on the women's issues, there were no divisions among the women. The women were able to come together around their issues, despite the politics. And the women's issues were safeguarded, and they ended up seeing their way through that, the kura ya makelele, with the passing of the Bomas document. But of course, you remember that what happened after that, it was rejected, and there was a very strong push for contentious issues to be identified and some minimum reforms to be carried out ahead of the next general election. And at that time, they had already identified the different groups, and women were not among those that were identified. So they decided that they were going to do the multi-sectoral forum on minimum reforms. But they said that every sector was to ensure that at least a third of its delegates to that multi-sectoral forum were women. And we said, no, the women must go in as a sector themselves, because we have our own special interests that need to be addressed. And so it fell on now Professor Wajiko Kabira and others to now come together and to put together a team. And so they put together, first of all, there was the lobbying. And I remember Honorable Martha Karua at that time was the Minister for Justice. And so advocacy was done to ensure that the women got their space. And so finally, the process was opened up to accommodate the women. And we went in. I think you were among them, Waboi, with you and me and Faith Kasiva and a few others. We were 8 of us in total. And our only role there was to safeguard the women's interests, because we said, whatever the case, whatever the politics they do here, ours is just to ensure that they don't tamper, they do not identify the women's issue as contentious. Because remember, they already had. They had actually identified the women's issue as a contentious issue, particularly the affirmative action and the district seats. And so they wanted to remove it. And so ours was just to make sure that whatever came out of Bomas for the women remained intact, regardless of the politics and the negotiating, the back and forth. And I think that we were relatively, but I think I'm jumping ahead. I'm jumping ahead because immediately after the Bomas, when Bomas talks collapsed, before we went into the multi-sectoral forum, there was what they were calling consensus building. They said they were going to do consensus building because the NAC administration had committed to 100 days of a new constitution. And this consensus building was to give us a document that actually was subjected to a referendum in 2005. And this document, part of the consensus building, was to try and look at the non-contentious issues that could form a constitution. And remember that they had actually identified the women's issue. If you remember, the late Bonaya Godana had brought in a proposal even at one time there in Naivasha And it's instructive to note that we actually had allies among members of parliament. I think there was Charity Ngilu, Honorable Charity Ngilu. There was Honorable Cecily Mbarire, and they told us what was going on, that these people were actually planning to remove some of the women's issue. And one of the proposals that Bonaya Godana was making was that instead of a third being given to women, that 5% of seats should be reserved for women, youth, and persons with disability to share among themselves. And they had a plan. They moved because we used to go to parliament quite a lot to go and do lobby and do demonstrations. They moved the talks from parliament to Naivasha, to the Sopa Lodge Inn in Naivasha, and they did it overnight, and we didn't know what to do. But we had good allies, and Lucy Githaiga at that time was with the. No, that time it was the Urgent Action Fund. Urgent Action Fund. We called them, and that was Betty Murungi, and we said this is very, very serious. We need to go to Naivasha. We need to go to Naivasha and stop these people. And so they said, go, and we got into cars and we got to Naivasha, and they were very shocked to find us there in the morning. And they were like, what are you doing here? And we said, you are not living here if you touch anything to do with the women. So that one failed. And so they moved the talk to Kilifi. You remember, they went to Kilifi. And so again, we went to that time now Action Aid. Lucy Githaiga was there. The GGP program was there, and we explained to them that this would actually be a very, it would be disastrous for women after every effort that had been put into the Bomas process. And we had formed what was called the National Women's Consensus Building Group, right? And so they flew us to Mombasa, and we were booked in the same hotel with the committee, the parliamentary committee that had moved there, and they were very, very upset. And remember, they told the hotel to throw us out. They said that we cannot stay in the same hotel. And so they said to us that, we would have to leave. So we had to move now to Travelers Lodge, but we used to have all our meals in the hotel. And you remember that the first day when we went now to start lobbying, we found riot police waiting at the gate, and we thought, oh, maybe there are other people who have found out the members of parliament are here. They are also coming to lobby. And we discovered that those riot police were actually brought there to stop the women. And we called Charity Ngilu, who was on the inside. I remember Faith Kasiva calling her, and Charity was furious, and she stormed out of the meeting. How dare you call riot police for the women? And she said she was going to walk, and it was about 1 kilometer from the road. And she was like, I'm walking in to bring those women. And so they had to stand down, and we were allowed. And eventually, we actually succeeded in safeguarding the women's gains. But because we had allies on the inside who were telling us what was happening, and even some of those male members of parliament, and I think one of our strongest supporters was the now late Simeon Nyachai, who was the chairman of the select committee. And so I think that was one of the strategies that we did well, that we were able to work with women on the inside, and we were able to mobilize on the outside and put a show of strength and fearlessly go in there to defend, plus also getting the donor support. Then we went now, after the referendum, the women were split at the referendum, which was very unfortunate. And we tried our best, not so much to support the referendum per se, but to tell women that it was important that we stick with our gains, because the politicians, everybody was sticking with their issue. The women were split. And you remember, we even had a meeting at the KICC, women for and against, the WACO draft. It was called the WACO draft. And we were on the side of the for. We were for it, but we were for it because we said we should stand with our issues. We shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And of course, it ended up being defeated, but we were able to stick with our issues and to safeguard our issues. Then we went into the multi-sectoral engagement, where there was still an attempt to see how to marginalize women and to identify the women's issues as a contentious issue. And we went in there. We were like, whatever you do, this one of the women you are not going to touch. And although the talks collapsed, we ended up at least safeguarding those. So I think that that collaborative effort between women who were in the legislature, men who supported the women's issues, and being able to use the women's rights organizations to raise the advocacy, those issues are the advocacy issues. And remember, we also mobilized quite a few. I mean, for during this time, we were mobilizing grassroots women across the country. We would come, we would have demonstrations. I think one time we had a walk from Nyayo Stadium all the way to Parliament. At least the police were less brutal those days. They never used to tear gas us, but at least they would come and they would tell us, you can't do this. But and we would all be out there on the streets, because I remember one day we were even with Phoebe Asio, we were with Zipporah Kiton. There were no divisions around the consolidation of the women's issues. And I think, we worked day and night. I remember people, we were not even doing much of this work in hotels. We were doing it in homes. Remember, we used to be at Kamla's house overnight, working weekends, and everybody pulling their weight. So I think that, yeah, that whole collaboration and agreement that on the women's issues, we cannot be divided. So I think for me, that's one of the biggest successes, so that we have the support of women in the legislature, in the systems, women in the CSOs, the support of donors, who were able to support our efforts and fund us, especially emergency funding, when things were thick. Yeah.
Were there other women's organizations that you worked with in this exercise?
I think that a lot of the women who came out of the Bomas process, women who were in the as delegates, and many of them who came like through the Maendeleo caucus, ended up actually being very, very serious champions. So I remember people like Martha Ropp, people like Happy Gloria. Then we had quite a few organizations. We also had other young women from the universities. Kina Jackie, she was called Jackie, the one who used to do the numbers for us. From all the 47 counties, we had women. And I mean, interestingly enough, even then, the leadership of Maendeleo was relatively collaborative. And I say that cautiously, because I think they are one of the women's rights organizations that have been seriously captured in terms of being able to mobilize women for the state, not necessarily for women. But at that time, we really didn't have that division. I know, especially under Rukia, we were able to work together and mobilize the women around the country. Well, the women themselves knew exactly what they wanted. Let me say that. It wasn't a case of telling the women what they wanted. It's what the women knew what they wanted. And in fact, I think that if anybody was clear about what they wanted, the women were very, very clear. One of the things I think that came out of now my own personal experience is that because of being so sheltered, not having faced discrimination and not encountering it on a day-to-day basis, you assume that some things are just a given. And it was very shocking to see how even the exclusion of women was systemic. The state essentially constitutionally did not recognize women as bona fide citizens. Women were known either through their fathers, through their husbands. If you didn't have a husband and your father was dead, through your brothers. If you had no brothers, through the chief, through your pastor, through your religious leader, as in, the state did not accord women the right of agency. That we had a constitution that actually didn't recognize women as bona fide citizens. So that whole system of exclusion was what women wanted to throw off the yoke of oppression. that was manifested in every area of their engagement. And it didn't matter whether it was at the rural level, where you are subjected to all the cultural discriminations and exclusions, and some of which were very devastating. And when we look at what we call the women's gains today, you look at the issues that really safeguard women. One, it is the recognition of women as bona fide citizens with equal rights as their male counterparts, equal rights in marriage, property, ownership, land rights, the right to not be discriminated against in any, whether through education, whether through, because of many women were penalized for being mothers, you couldn't, you had to decide to be a mother or to work, or the penalties that come with it. Your reproductive rights were threatened. So I think that the women really knew, they really knew what they wanted, and you can see it adequately captured in the Constitution.
What strategies did the women use to ensure that what women wanted was adopted in the new constitution?
They did. One, I think one of the best strategies that was used was information and awareness to, a large group of women, the rural women, so that they understood the issues and they could not be divided. So that even when people were going there to divide them, they would say, no, 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 actually, we know this. Then the other was now identifying hostile members, members who were hostile, and then devising strategies of how to approach them, and even adopting members of parliament. So like now, if Waboy, you would be given a member of parliament who you adopt, and it was your work to build understanding with that member and woo them towards our persuasion, and so a lot of advocacy work came in, and then having allies, really strong allies, who would let you know what was going on and who are the people to look out for. I mean, it's also interesting to know that, remember, we also had some women who were not for the women's agenda, and they were negotiating downwards. They were saying different things from what we were saying on the outside, and so it then we organized ourselves, bringing in quite a large group of women to be able to say, look, this is what we are saying. Here we are. This is how we are represented. Anybody telling you anything different is speaking for themselves, because this represents the wider lobby of women. So I think that and they were and having men speak out for us. I mean, remember, some of our strong allies. Paul Moiter was one of our very strong allies. Kiraitu Murungi was also one of our very strong allies. There was Honorable Simeon Nyachai, who was also one of our very strong ally. Yes, Mutula Kilonzo. Mutula Kilonzo was a very strong ally of the women, the late Mutula Kilonzo, very, very strong, and always had time for us, and was always ready to accommodate us. Kipkalia Kones was also one of our very strong allies. So, and you see, they were not just strong allies for us women, but they were also voices that carried weight. I mean, they were able to speak in places where voices needed to be heard. So having strong male allies was also a very, very good strategy. And to have key allies, I mean, Simeon Nyachai, who was the chairman, you remember, he insisted that the women must be allowed. Remember, they had refused for the women to come and present their issues. And because he was a strong ally of ours, he insisted, no, the women must present their issues before the committee. And that actually gave us quite mileage, and he became now the one to carry our agenda in the House. Yeah.
What challenges did the women face during the constitution-making process, and how did they overcome them?
Politics, and I think this is also something that we need to recognize, because if we are going to overcome, we must be able to see even where our weaknesses are, right? The politics that we saw taking center stage on the national landscape, it infiltrated the women's movement. And a lot of it was tribal in nature. So that if a certain political leader was being vilified, it became difficult to now woo the women who supported that political leader to that persuasion, because it seemed that it was supporting government. It was construed to mean that you were in support of whatever government was doing. So I think that is also problematic. And I see it today also, where women are divided, not even around their issues, but they are divided along the male political elite divisions, so that they are not able to come together and say, we as women, we don't care what you people are fighting about. These are our issues. And I think that also saw a weakening of the strength of the women's lobby, because up until then, the women were able to safeguard a lot until the divisions came. And we saw it. The divisions came within the women's rights organization. We saw it in the commission. We saw those divisions, but it was not divisions based on ideology or the disagreement around what the women want. No, it was political in nature, and it took a tribal tone as well. So I think those were some of the challenges, so that now we started seeing infighting and straight up sabotage.
Were there other challenges beyond politics and ethnicity?
I think some of them were also the backlash against women themselves within their homes. Their homes. Some of the women who were real champions ended up also facing quite a bit of backlash in their homes, because they were seen as not being good women. I remember one of the women that we knew who was a great champion ended up having serious domestic issues, and was even beaten. She was subjected to domestic violence, and she was kicked out of her home. Martha Robb. So that, I think, also was the backlash from the community is something that I think women did face, because they were seen as being champions of those things that are un-African. Because it has been the subjugation of women, and women being put down and women keeping quiet has been seen as, those are good women, the ones who accept that the translation equals that those are good women. So these are the ones who want power. They want to take over men. They want to take over the roles of men. These are not good women. And I think that is problematic. And then also that sense of the men feeling like they're being emasculated. I think that's also a bit of a problem, because then what happens is that you meet with resistance, because the men feel. I remember when we came back from Mombasa, and we were at the carousel waiting for our luggage. Honorable Gideon Conchella said, "Oh my goodness, if the women who are coming to parliament are like you people, basi tumejitia kitanzi." So, a fear of strong women. I mean, I wouldn't even say strong women, but women who know their mind and who know what they want. And that is seen as a threat. And so I think that a lot of women have faced backlash because of it, especially in the rural areas. And so and of course, women, don't associate with those women. That's also a strategy that the politicians use of demonizing uh, the strong women. So they want you to bring the weak ones that they can manipulate. Don't bring us the strong women. Don't bring us women who can hold their ground. Bring us women who we can woo with to things, so that they abandon your cause. And that, I think, has been a problem. And I think we see it even today, after the space has been thrown wide open. You see the women who are now in that space are not women who are holding ground for women's rights. You see they are manipulated into supporting the men and the status quo.
What are the most important gains in the Constitution, especially those related to economic empowerment?
So for me, the greatest gain is the recognition of the people, we the people, as the sovereign. Okay? So that power emanates from us, the people, and not from them, the duty bearers. So the sovereignty of the people, then the law as supreme, the supremacy of the Constitution, so that everybody is subject to the Constitution, whether citizen or duty bearer. Okay, so that for me is one of the greatest gains that we've gotten as the Constitution, because up until then, the sovereign seemed to be the leaders, but and where they came up against anything that they were unhappy with within the Constitution, where the law became an obstruction to them being able to fully, exert themselves, they simply changed the law. Whereas with the Constitution 2010, we now have a constitution that's not that easy to amend, so that you are subject to the law. All of us are subject to the law. So that's one. Two, participation of the people, that we are supposed to be actively involved in the governance of our country, how we are governed, but also our responsibility to uphold the rule of law as citizens. And for me, that speaks a lot, because Kenyans like to lament. However, when we cast our vote, we abandon. After we have cast our vote, we abandon. We don't participate actively. So that active participation of citizens is something I think which is a gain, and something that we really need to take more advantage of. Then we have, of course, the women's gains, the recognition of women as bona fide citizens. And not only that, the demand by the Constitution that they must be involved in all governance issues. Governance, whether it is economic governance, social, and political. So for me, political is important, because contrary to what people think, politics is so central even in our day-to-day lives, because it is at the political level that many decisions are made. Legislation is passed, resource allocation, budgetary allocations, division of revenue, prioritization of projects. All these things are done at the legislative and executive level. So the political, and the gateway to that is the political gateway. Now, women are there, they're involved. In fact, the first election under the new constitution brought in more women than we've ever had in independent Kenya. So essentially putting women in the center of the change that needs to happen. Because for all the things to be resolved, whether it is cultural issues, economic issues, political issues, social issues, they will be resolved through legislative programs, policies, budgets. The Constitution puts women in the center of the change that needs to happen. So whether it is legislative change to have repealing of legislation or creation of legislation, and we have seen that actually ever since we got more women into the legislature, we've actually seen many laws that have been enacted that secure them. The Domestic Violence Act, the Matrimonial Property Act. It is the women who actually started. I don't think it has been passed, but they're the ones who actually brought a bill into the House on food security, so that we avoid this perpetual situation where Kenyans are, between famine and drought, are ever, dying of hunger and are food insecure. So putting women in the center and at all levels of governance, right? So that for me is significant. Also, the recognition of the equal rights and opportunity, so that you have the right to inherit property, to own property, to live anywhere, and to inherit even your parents. The right to matrimonial property, and also equal rights with to look after your children, because we know how many women have been abandoned by men. They are raising children, single female headed household, whereby men have essentially just abandoned the woman and the child. And so now, even that, constitutionally, they are required to have they have equal responsibility. And a lot of these things come from those experiences. But for me, also, the non-discrimination on any grounds, and the requirement for the state to be proactive in redressing that marginalization and inclusion and integrating women. That's really important. And so even when you look at economically, women were economically marginalized and denied the right to even the opportunity for economic empowerment, because they were denied one of the most critical factors of production, which was land and land ownership, which could either be used for tilling, because they do most of the labor. I mean, at least 70 to 80% of the labor is provided by women, but because they don't own the land, they also don't get to the say over how the productive resources from that land are utilized. So you would find that while they provide all that labor, they are still poor. So they have the opportunity now to own the land, to inherit the land. But aside from that, the state should actively promote programs that will address the marginalization. And this marginalization is not just political, because you see, we've a lot of the time when we talk about marginalization, we look at politics, and there's been a lot of focus on the political angle, but it's also because politics is very important. The political gateway is extremely important in being able to redress. I mean, through the political gateway, you're able to have a ripple effect across the board. But the government has a responsibility to address all the exclusion of women. So whether it is cultural, whether it's economic, whether it's political, programs must be put in place, policies must be put in place. And I do believe that they have. I mean, access to credit so that they can become productive. There's been programs designed around that kind of thing. And I think one of the ones that we must credit, the Honorable Charity Ngilu, because people never talk about where it came from. And you see, this is another thing about invisibilizing women. We talk about AGPO, the 30% procurement opportunities. If you remember, during the campaigns of the Jubilee, the initial coalition was coalition of 4 parties. There was the TNA, URP, NARC of Charity Ngilu, and the Republican Party of Najib Balala. In Kasarani, during one of the campaigns, Charity Ngilu came and said she wanted a commitment from the 2 principals, who were the flag bearers for the party, for the coalition, that when they come into government, 30% of all procurement opportunities must be made available to women, representing at least not quite a third, but almost a third, okay? And that innovation, today we talk about AGPO, and AGPO really does have the potential of really shifting the economic balance, between men and women. But we never give credit that it was actually the innovation of a woman, the Honorable Charity Ngilu. She is actually the one who came up with this idea. So you see, when women have those opportunities to come in, there are certain women, I'm not saying all, because some of them are also rogue, and we mustn't paint women as being at the best of people, but we do see that we have some women who, when they do come in, they actually bring in ideas and programs that alleviate women. And Charity Ngilu is one of those women. You remember, as the Minister for Health, she is the one who came up with free maternity. She was like, why? Why should the state penalize women? When she was the Minister for Health, she made it illegal for hospitals to hold hostage mothers and their babies because they couldn't pay bills, as the minister, So, I mean, these are stories that we need to tell, that when women do come in, they come in with positive things. So there's been the Constitution, Article 27(6) of the Constitution, requires the state to take legislative, policy, and other measures to redress marginalization suffered by the marginalized groups, of which women is among those groups. So that, for me, can be interpreted in many ways. But if the same article on non-discrimination says that you cannot discriminate economically, socially, or politically, that means that there must be programs that address the economic marginalization of women.
What lessons can we learn from women's mobilization and negotiations during the constitution-making process?
I think the biggest lesson that we can learn is that there is power in unity. If we are agreed on something and we move together as one, even though there are 2 small dissenting voices, but majority are speaking the same thing, we can do a lot more. So we makes me stronger. So women working together is a very strong force. 2 is male allies. Important for us to have male allies, because whether we like it or not, patriarchy has delegitimized the voice of women. And so having men speaking for women also helps push our agenda. We've had some very, very strong and honorable male allies who've helped move the women agenda. And so we must identify champions who can help us move the women's economic agenda as well, using the exact same strategy, because we're not going to go to a different thing. We need legislation. For women's economic empowerment, we need legislation, we need policies, we need programs, we need budgetary allocations. And so we're going to have to find male champions who we can use to speak for us, and that we and women and understanding, if we are able to raise the civic awareness. Because you see, one of the things that a lot of people, not just women, a lot of people run away from when it comes to economic issues, people don't want to talk about it. People don't want to talk about it because they feel they don't understand economic issues. It's very esoteric discipline. And so, but women, I think, are the most innovative. Today, we have banks that have all these products for what they call investment products. But you know what? It's women who started those investment groups. Because of their economic marginalization, women learned how to come together and put together small, small monies. There are groups that were even putting as little as 5 shillings. 5 shillings coming together, and then they would lend to one of their own. When you go, you build yourself, you come back, and together they built each other. And with that, women have been able to do so much. Women are also very innovative. Look at all these women, despite the economic marginalization, how many women have been able to do amazing things with so little. They're so innovative. And so we need to help women see that the strategies they've been using for survival are strategies that can be scaled up for their economic empowerment, so that it's not just survival, bringing them out of survival mode into economic empowerment. Because we will not be able to sufficiently be sufficiently politically emancipated if we are not economically emancipated. For as long as you're poor, for as long as you're living in the margins, you're easily manipulable. If today, we look at how women have survived, some of it is, eating every other day, or something like that. But if a politician comes with sacks of unga, sugar, and whatever, you see them as savior. Or if they give you something small, something maybe that you don't earn on a daily basis, you see them as a savior. And then women, of course, being faithful, they then go and elect these people. They'll vote for them because, they did me a good turn. Yet they don't realize that much of that money that is being distributed by way of incentives for votes is actually the money that is being taken out of the system for services that would have made your life better. So we need to educate women. They need to understand the dynamics of their economic disempowerment. And they also need to understand that their innovation towards economic survival is a tactic that can be used can be upscaled to economically empower them.
How can these lessons be used to promote policy change for women's economic empowerment?
We need to decide which policy we need to look at, and this is where you academicians come in handy. Do the research. Which policy can we advocate for adoption that would have sweeping benefits, because there are certain approaches whereby if you touch one thing, it has a ripple effect, of addressing many others. And we need to find what that is, like sort of like the silver bullet, what is it? And for me, actually, I think AGPO could be that if it is designed in a certain way. And if we follow through, if we address the corruption and all the gaps and all, and work together with financial institutions, looking, because the economy, it's a very diverse thing. It's not economic empowerment is not, you can't say that you can do a one-touch thing, right? However, because you look at on the one hand, we've got a fund that gives you money, but on the other hand, we have the government taking away everything through heavy taxation, on the one hand, we have government giving us opportunity to procurement opportunities. And then on the other hand, you've got crippling corruption, systemic corruption that ends up hampering even payment of bills. So there are many things that need to be put together. However, I do believe that a comprehensive strategy can be adopted, looking at the various things that can be done towards streamlining some of these things, sealing the gaps, but ultimately it will take political will, because the fight that we see these days for people to get into power, it's not because they want to administer the state, it's because they want the money that comes with power, the access to that money. So it's almost seen as though, bringing women in and bringing them into that thing will be taking away, it's like taking meat out of people's mouths, it's like taking food out of people's bellies. So but I do think that through research we can identify policies or a policy that would have a ripple effect in terms of being able to address many of the challenges and the inefficiencies that we have towards women's empowerment. Because it's not that they're not programs. Those programs have been there. Even from the time of Kibaki, remember there was this program where the DSDOs used to give, 50K to women's groups and all. So there's always been some kind of programs that are there, but they're hampered by one thing or another. And that's what we need to be able to stitch together to actually see where are the inconsistencies, where are the challenges, and what kind of an approach, either policy or program, can we propose that would have a multiple effect across the board on some of those challenges. So we must put our heads together and look at what can be done, because right now the government is also desperate for solutions. I mean, they have open ears. So we should take advantage of the fact that post recovery strategies, post-economic recovery strategies are really being looked for. So we should inform them. I think it's a bad idea for government to think, it's lazy thinking, that economic recovery is going to come from borrowing and taxing your people to infinity. We need to be able to inform those strategies. So let's put our heads together and make a case for what we have arrived at.
Ay, ay,